So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we are going to be looking at a really important key passage out of First Corinthians. So, let me just start out by reading that. This comes out of chapter 1 of First Corinthians, starting in verse 18. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are being destroyed, but is the power of God for those of us who are being saved. It is written in Scripture, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, I will reject the intelligence of the intelligent. Who are the wise? Where are the legal experts? Where are today's debaters? Hasn't God made the wisdom of the world foolish? In God's wisdom, he determined that the world wouldn't come to know him through its wisdom. Instead, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of preaching. Jews ask for signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, which is a scandal to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is God's power and God's wisdom. This is because the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. So one of the things that was pointed out to me this week is in overall Paul's writing, his favorite topic, or a topic that he likes to talk a lot more about than the cross, is the resurrection. The fact that God is bringing life out of death, brings meaning out of meaninglessness, and the fact that we get to experience that. Yet this passage is considered by many one of the keys of kind of New Testament theology, recognizing how important the cross is and how much it still is controversial, how much it still offends us. And so the question is why Paul, who would much rather talk about the resurrection, needs to talk about the cross here. Why is this important? And I think the reason this is important is kind of the context. He's writing to this group of churches that are in Corinth. And so I think he brings up the cross and kind of the offensiveness of the cross for a couple of reasons. The first one is the city of Corinth itself is a city that prides itself on its cultural, intellectual life. It's a place where people go with ambition. They want to make a name for themselves. And so if he is trying to talk about maybe a contrast between Christianity and the kind of the cultural milieu in which he is, they are all having church and doing life, the cross is going to be a pretty big and important one. On top of just the cultural contexts, another of the major reasons that Paul is writing is because this kind of series of house churches that are the Corinthian churches are just deeply divided. They don't agree on some really fundamental things. I think some of it is they're trying to kind of one-up each other, trying to show who's more spiritual. They're kind of rallying around different leaders where, like, I'm more of a Paul guy, or I'm more of an Apollos guy, which, of course, ironically, none of these leaders really seem to want to claim these kind of groups that are around them. So they're kind of more like symbols of the actual people who tended to get along pretty well and tended to have the same critiques of this group. Another kind of criticism Paul seems to have, again, overall in these letters, is like us nowadays, they seem to want to skip over kind of the hard parts of following Christ, and they wanted to kind of skip to the good stuff. So they seem to want to talk a lot about kind of, heaven and eschatology, the end things, when everything is good, when we've arrived and are in our glory. They seem to want to talk about spiritual gifts and how fun those things are and kind of the joyous aspects. But Paul, I think, is offering like, hey, if we really want to get to those things, if we really want to understand those things, if we really want to grow into maturity, we can't get around the difficulties, the hard part of the Christian message, which very much includes the cross. And so he kind of throws it out there at the first point saying, look, if you are going to try to understand following Christ in the terms of your culture, you're going to be offended by this. The cross and what happened to Jesus is going to offend everybody across the board. So he mentions kind of two groups representing kind of different ways of thinking about it, and the fact that Jesus dying on a cross is offensive to both of them. So he first mentions Jews, right? So Jews, at the time when Jesus came, are essentially kind of a backward-looking people. They want to go back to the glory days. They love talking about Messiah because Messiah is King David. It's Israel at its glorious. They are looking backwards saying, okay, maybe if we can draw these lines in the sand, maybe if we can be holy enough, and follow the rules enough and get all the kind of scummy, wrong people out of our midst, then we get the glory days back. They want a Messiah who's going to come in and kill Gentiles. And instead, they get a Messiah who, first off, comes and kind of tries to explode a lot of their understanding of purity. It's not going to be enough to try hard enough to get God's attention so they can earn kind of this gift of the good old days back again. They want a Messiah that is going to come in and kill Gentiles and put them back on top. And instead, they get a Messiah that is killed by the Gentiles, right? So that is pretty offensive. They did not get the power and the glory that they wanted. What about Paul's talking about the Greeks, which would have been kind of a shorthand way of saying everyone interested in kind of modern philosophy. The Greeks were like the ideal thinkers and philosophers and kings of culture. So the Romans wanted to be like the Greeks, and the Persians wanted to be like the Greeks in the day. So it's kind of more the shorthand for kind of the sophisticated urban cultural elite that everyone would have been part of. And so the gospel's just as offensive to them, right? So it starts out by saying, okay, Jesus, the founder of our movement, the man we believe was God himself, was killed by the Romans, the people that we look up to so much of the time, the people who have power and have sophistication. Well, they killed him. They thought he was wrong. They thought that they needed to show that they were more powerful than him. But don't worry, God resurrected him. And this one is easy for us to look past because we're kind of used to the idea of resurrection. But again, Greek philosophy at the time was very dualistic. There was the spiritual and there was the physical. And you were trying to get rid of the physical so you could get at the spiritual. So even the fact that Jesus became a person is offensive. The fact that God resurrected his body, they were able to touch him. He carried the scars. The fact that we are embodied being, that's offensive to the philosophy of the day. But don't worry, it gets worse. Not only did he resurrect him, but then Jesus in his bodily form left and is now with God, and his kingdom is largely invisible. And we have to wait to see it come to its culmination, right? You can't just point to it and say, hey, go be with this philosopher, go be with this true form of power. And instead, the invitation is to wait and follow and deny yourself and not achieve enlightenment or prestige in this world. Come join a community of largely unimpressive people because we believe the true kingdom, the true goodness is yet to come, right? Again, the cross and the way Jesus did things was offensive. It's not what people wanted to hear. And I think to a culture that they desperately wanted to make the way they followed God kind of relevant. They wanted to fit in. They wanted to make it make sense. I think Paul has 2 points that he's going to make in the section I just read, and just overall, just something that needs to be really fundamentally understood why it was that Paul is talking about the cross, why maybe even God used this bizarre method to challenge us and to invite us in another way of being in the world. And the first kind of just basic assumption that I don't want us to miss is that the cross proves that God's ways are fundamentally opposed to the values, to the techniques, to the tools of this fallen world around us. And so I would argue that means we simply cannot value things the way they do. Most of the time, that's going to be things like power and prestige and wanting people to like us and have influence. It also, I would argue, means we cannot use the same tools that the world uses, right? Tools that often feel in the short term very effective. Tools like violence, tools like the latest marketing strategies, or tools like the most sophisticated, academic research, or the newest technologies even at times. We are called to be holy, and holy has 2 kind of meanings. It does mean purity. It means different and in a different way, but it also just simply means different, odd, goddish, valuing things that the way that God does. And so again, just to reiterate this point, we don't get to use their values and those things. And so the cross Christianity, leadership in Christianity, spiritual depth in Christianity, whatever, we cannot use it to enhance either our own or politically our prestige, our sense of power. It is not a tool to be used as some other means to an end. The end is always following Christ and becoming like Christ and doing things the way Christ does. So at this point in the argument, the cross and the way Paul is arguing it makes for a pretty tough selling point, right? Like, why would anyone want anything to do with this? Because, as Paul says here, the cross is the power of God for those of us who are called and changed. And I think this is kind of the key of understanding why it is he's creating this contrast, right? Because ultimately, if we want to know who God is, and if we want to know what God values, we have to look at the incarnate, crucified God. Jesus is the ultimate image of what God is all about. And so if we think God is primarily about power, if we think God is primarily about something else like inclusion or love, sometimes is one of the arguments, right? If God is primarily about creativity, etc., we're going to have a very different idea of God. If we look at who fundamentally God is, God came in bodily form and taught and lived among the least and was willing to suffer and sacrifice himself for the sake of lifting up others. That is fundamentally who God is. That is fundamentally who we are following. I think the cross also puts a very stark relief on kind of approach that would have been in back in Paul's day, but I think is very in right now. And that is the cross only works. The cross is only appealing if God is real and if God really is kind of this crucified God that I was just describing, right? If the cross is just meant to be inspirational, if Jesus' teachings are just something that we can look at and be like, oh yeah, he's got some pretty good ideas, and pick and choose from it, or feel inspired by it, or use it for our own self-actualization, or use it, again, as a means to an end, we're going to be disappointed. The cross only works as this ultimate horror of God being murdered because God's power was through that to use this tool to change the world, to change individual lives. And I think that is the key. The cross becomes this tool that changes everything because that is who God is and how God chose to do things. And that is the tool, because ultimately he is talking to people not who are considering this from an intellectual perspective, but people whose hearts and whose lives have been changed by an actual working God. And that is the key to why the cross works. People need to come and let parts of themselves die that we can be resurrected, right? And the people he is talking to, and many of the people that will see this or will be discussing on Sunday, have experienced this as well. People who were formerly broken, whether inside or outside, whose lives were a mess or whatever, healing and wholeness is coming to. Some of the time that's physical, some of the times that's spiritual. People are growing and changing and being healed. People experience this in God, in the crucified God. That's why it is the power. It actually does work. It doesn't work on the terms we want. It's not safe, but it's true and it's real, and we can experience actual freedom. We can experience freedom from sins. We can experience people who are enslaved to ourselves, to sin, to the culture, literally at times, right? We can find freedom. We can find change. We can find wholeness. Those who are excluded can find inclusion in a community. We have seen groups of people who should not be able to get along in any way, shape, or form, like the people Paul is talking to, form deep communities of lives being changed, of inviting things, of God's presence in the world. And so that is why the cross is so important. We can't hold it up as an ideal. We are embarrassed of it because it doesn't work. It doesn't play nicely with whatever kind of cultural values or even the values we wish we could have. It's not something we can wield and use for ourselves. It's only something that can change us so that we can be used for others. And so the fundamental question Paul is asking in a group of people who need healing from who they are as people and all the things that are breaking them, who need healing as a community because they're deeply shattered, right? The question he's asking is our entire identity going to be we are followers of this crucified God, who the world may think of as a loser, but we know better. We've seen that this thing works. We have seen hearts and lives transformed. We have experienced it ourselves. And if that's the case, that means rather than us trying to constantly define who God is and fit him into our categories, God gets to do the opposite. He gets to define us. First, on the negative place, right? We are broken sinners. We are in need of death and destruction, which we join him on that cross, that we may be resurrected, that may be reformed into completely new types of human beings. That's the message of the cross. And it also kind of implies an ongoing judgment on God's part. That's that quote from the Old Testament, right? On this just ideal of self-sufficiency, on this ideal of the world's wisdom, which we're trying to avoid kind of pain and suffering, in which we're trying to seek out comfort and our own prestige, whatever. That stuff all needs to die on the cross too, because God is inviting us into ultimate freedom, ultimate community, ultimate healing, ultimate just belonging in that kingdom. And so the cross continues to be a challenging and frightening ideal. And yet, if we know God, if we trust who God says he is and trust the work that he did in the cross, we also can experience the resurrection and a changed world and changed lives and changed communities whatsoever. And so the invitation, as always in Paul, in Jesus, is, will you come and follow? Will you trust that I am who I say I am? And that you are who I say you are, not who anyone else says you are. That's the cross as this kind of crucible, as this crossroads we all have to walk through, both as we start this journey and as we continue to take up our crosses day by day.